All right, now I'll get back to the beginning of the chapter. So, what is life is the first section. Again, the objectives are on Blackboard and they're on this slide. Biology is the study of life. And so, I want to ask you, what do you think? Are these things here alive? You can go ahead and pause and think about it, but we'll get back to this at the end. So, once you've thought about it, you can hit play again. There is no one succinct definition of life. In fact, life is so diverse that scientists have had to come up with 6 basic properties that all organisms share. And we're going to go through each of them. So they're maintenance of an organized complexity, maintenance and use of energy, sensing and responding to stimuli, growth, reproduction, and evolution. So organized complexity, what does that mean? Non-living things can be complex or they can be organized, but not both. So for example, here is a salt crystal. It is highly organized into a specific shape, but it's actually only made up of 2 different types of atoms. So it's not very complex. The ocean water, for example, is filled with every known element and all of these animals living inside. The water itself has every single element, but it's completely disorganized. Everything's just free floating around in there. So it's really complex, but it's not organized. So non-living things are not both. Living things are both complex and organized. All living things are made of cells, and cells are a very complex and organized thing. They comprise all living things. All living things are made of cells. There are 2 types of cells. There are eukaryotic cells and there are prokaryotic cells. Eukaryotic cells are mostly multicellular organisms, but some are unicellular. So this is going to be, humans, mushrooms, trees, leopards. Those are eukaryotic. They have organelles that are surrounded by membranes inside the cells. And then they also have DNA inside of a nucleus. Prokaryotic cells are always going to be unicellular organisms. They don't have membrane-bound organelles. So the organelles themselves, organelles in the eukaryotic cells perform different functions. Prokaryotic cells are much more simple and they don't have these. And also their DNA is not protected by a nucleus. Both types of cells are surrounded by a plasma membrane though, so that's important to know. They've got plasma membrane, they have ribosomes, and they have DNA. Organisms acquire and use materials and energy. So energy and materials are what we need for our survival. There are different types of organisms that can actually make their own food, so they don't have to acquire the energy from somewhere else. They can just make it themselves. Plants, algae, and bacteria, they can do that. Some bacteria can do that through photosynthesis. All the other organisms have got to consume their food to get energy. And then important minerals like water, are important materials like minerals and water we can acquire from the air, from water, soil, bodies of other living things. We use energy to help maintain our constant internal environment. So all living things have the ability to maintain this thing called homeostasis. An example of homeostasis is how humans are able to maintain an internal body temperature. One of the ways we can do that is by sweating to cool ourselves down. So that's why I've shown this man who has clearly been exercising and has started to sweat. That will help to core down his core temperature because as the sweat evaporates off of his skin, the heat will go with it. Energy flows all through ecosystems and all through different organisms. So you get energy from the sun going into plants, and plants are able to photosynthesize. They can then use the energy that they store. That energy could also be eaten by organisms. Organisms can eat other organisms, so consume one another. So energy just gets transferred all around in the environment, and a lot of it is also lost as heat. Organisms sense and respond to stimuli. So basically what that means is that if you touch it, it moves. If it you know, gets bright, it might move towards the light. So an example would be this water flea here. It has antennae and it has an eye. So it can touch and feel things, searching for food, and it can use its eyes to move toward prey or maybe away from prey. So that movement after it senses something is that responding to the stimulus. This is a euglena. It's a protist, so a single-celled eukaryote. They have an eye spot down here near their flagella, and it senses light. So these are photosynthetic, so they need light to make their own food. So one of the things that they can do is sense where it's bright and move their bodies towards it so that they can photosynthesize more. Organisms all grow. So that means they're increasing in size. Bacteria have to double their size before they divide in half to make another bacteria. Multicellular organisms may also go through a process called development. So the development increases the organism's complexity as it grows. An example, a really obvious one that's easy for humans to understand, is how a baby that's born, a full-term fetus, comes out looking like a baby, but it started out as just one cell that grew into many cells and went through a huge development process. So as it was growing, it was developing into a more complex organism. All organisms reproduce. So reproduction is when you give rise to offspring of the same type. So the offspring are going to inherit instructions for maintaining life from their parents, and those instructions are held in DNA, which is a hereditary molecule. So this is a really kind of sub-property here, is that all of them reproduce and all of them have to have DNA in order to do that because they're passing the DNA on to their offspring. All organisms evolve. So all living organisms today have descended from an ancient common ancestor. And today's diverse forms of life have arisen through a process of descent with modification known as evolution. We're going to be going over evolution in the next section, which I think is after this. So now we're going to get back to this. So were these alive? What did you think? Cows. Yes, cows are alive. They acquire energy through eating. They can reproduce. They maintain an homeostasis. They've got all this stuff. What about just a brain all by itself? So no, this brain, it cannot function on its own. It cannot reproduce on its own. What about this hot dog? So hot dogs, they are made of once living things, but they're not alive anymore. They can't reproduce. They don't, mate with other hot dogs and make hot dog babies. Tree is alive. That was probably pretty easy for you. If it wasn't, that's okay. Some people aren't positive about plants. Fire is usually a really tough one for people. And the answer to this is that it is not alive. A lot of people think it is, and I think it's because it has you kind of view it as having a mind of its own. Wildfires spread, so it's like they're growing and reproducing, but fires are not made of cells. Fire is just electricity, basically. Okay, and a screwdriver made of metal and plastic, not alive, cannot reproduce and make screwdriver babies. So I think that's one of the easiest ways for me to start by seeing if something is alive, is that does it reproduce and make more of itself? So that's not the only thing, but that's a good place to start because a lot of things just simply don't do that. And then you can go on to ask the other questions. Is it made of cells? Does it maintain a homeostasis? So for example, let's say maybe screwdrivers could reproduce on their own. Screwdrivers can't always stay the same temperature though, can they? If it's cold outside and you leave it outside, it's going to feel cold. If you put it in the oven, it's going to feel hot. That's kind of what's going on there. And then ultimate question here, are viruses alive? So viruses are infectious agents and they're made up of a couple things. They've only on the inside got a genetic material, so that's going to be DNA or RNA, and then they're going to be surrounded by protein. That's usually it. Some viruses also have a layer of fat around them. So viruses cannot reproduce on their own. They have to infect a host, and then the host, like a human, would recreate or reproduce more virus particles. And the way that it does that is that DNA gets into the human cells, and the human cells are the ones that make all the components of the virus, put them together and spit them out. So they can't reproduce on their own, but they do mutate and evolve. In fact, HIV, human immunodeficiency virus, is super difficult to treat because it mutates so quickly. One of the biggest issues with HIV is that it is constantly mutating. People who have HIV are often on several different types of drugs at the same time, antiviral drugs, because their virus particles will mutate in a way that they can resist the drugs. SARS-CoV-2 has mutated. You've probably heard this in the news, that there is a new, more infectious strain going around. A couple of confirmed cases in Texas so far. All right, so that's the end of that section.